The Quantum Paradox of Camelot, a logic audit of the Kennedy vector. I always find that the truth announces itself in strange ways. Not with trumpets or fireworks, but with a faint electrical hum in the air, like the feeling you get right before touching a doorknob that's absolutely plotting to shock you. When I sit down with the file on John Fitzgerald Kennedy, that same hum hits me. It is a familiar sensation, the one I get whenever I sense that official history is smiling at me a little too wide, like a mall Santa whose beard is peeling off at the edges. The Kennedy file doesn't just contain facts, it contains distortions, omissions, footnotes hiding barrels of dynamite, and enough psychological tension to qualify as its own Hitchcock film. Before I even start reading, my mind braces itself, quietly whispering, "Okay, brother, here we go, let's peel back the first layer and see who screams." Look, I'm going to be straight with you. Most people approach the Kennedy era like it is some kind of historical Sudoku puzzle, a brain teaser to solve between Netflix binges. They obsess over the ballistics, the umbrella man, the grassy knoll, treating the death of a president like a game of Clue where Colonel Mustard is the CIA and the candlestick is a magic bullet. But that is not what we are doing here. We are not playing parlor games with a tragedy. This is a logic audit. We are stripping the paint off the ride to see the structural fractures underneath. Because what happened in those 1037 days of Camelot wasn't just a political administration, it was a collision between a rapidly evolving consciousness and a rigid, terrified system. It was the moment the Matrix glitched. Let me set the scene, not as a historian, but as a forensic psychologist looking at a crime scene that encompasses the entire American soul. November 22, 1963, didn't just kill a man, it shattered the collective agreement about how reality works. 1 minute, the script is running smoothly, handsome president, beautiful wife, sunshine in Dallas, the post-war boom humming along like a pristine Cadillac. The next minute, the narrative head explodes like a watermelon at a Gallagher show, and suddenly the audience is covered in the messy, brutal truth that chaos is always waiting in the wings. It is exactly like that moment in The Matrix when Neo stops seeing the girl in the red dress and starts seeing the green code raining down. Except in 1963, we didn't get to learn Kung Fu, we just got the trauma. To understand why the system reacted so violently to Kennedy, like a biological organism attacking a virus, we have to look at the man through a philosophical lens. Specifically, we need to apply the Stoic filter. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who spent more time fighting barbarians than enjoying his palace, once wrote, "The object of life is not to be on the side of the majority, but to escape finding oneself in the ranks of the insane." Kennedy embodied this paradox. He was a man both inside the system, wealthy, connected, patrician, and yet, philosophically, he was operating outside the asylum's rules. Consider the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the stress test of the century. You have the best and the brightest generals, men with chests full of medals and heads full of sawdust, practically foaming at the mouth for nuclear war. To them, global annihilation was just another logistical hurdle, an Xbox achievement to unlock on the path to winning the Cold War. They wanted to bomb. They wanted to invade. They were playing checkers with live grenades. Kennedy, however, chose the path of the Stoic. He applied the brakes. He ignored the screaming voices in the Situation Room, the guys who think toughness is measured by how many people you can incinerate, and chose a blockade. He called it a quarantine, because semantics are a weapon if you know how to wield them. That is not just politics, that is Epictetus whispering, make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. But here is where the logic gets dark. The same philosophical mindset that made Kennedy effective at saving the world also made him a mortal threat to the machinery of the world. Systems do not like variables they cannot control. That is not conspiracy theory, that is basic organizational theory 101. It is the same logic that makes a bureaucracy crush an innovator or a corporation fire a whistleblower. It is the robot principle where the AI decides that, to protect the hive, the unpredictable element must be neutralized. Kennedy was the ultimate unpredictable element. He was a variable in an equation that demanded constants. Now, let's audit the economic and spiritual ledger, because this is where the corporate comedy hour really kicks in. We live in a society built on a very specific premise. You are empty, you are scared, and the only way to fix that is to buy things. Consumerism is the state religion, and the mall is the cathedral. Kennedy threatened this ecosystem not just with regulations, but with something far more dangerous, purpose. When he launched the Peace Corps, when he pushed for the moon shot, when he told people to ask not what your country can do for you, he was essentially handing everyone a pair of those sunglasses from John Carpenter's They Live. You know the ones, you put them on, and suddenly the billboard that says, enjoy your vacation, actually says, obey, and consume. Kennedy was telling a generation of Americans that their value wasn't in their purchasing power, but in their service. He was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the point of life isn't to die with the most toys, but to contribute to the human story. Do you have any idea how terrifying that is to the military-industrial complex in the corporate boardrooms? It is like walking into a McDonald's and handing out homemade organic sandwiches. The system doesn't know how to process it. If people start finding meaning in service, in art, in exploration, in peace, well, who is going to buy the plastic junk? Who is going to support the next war for profit? Who is going to stay on the hamster wheel? Money doesn't like meaning. Money likes predictability. And Kennedy was trafficking in high-grade, unauthorized meaning. This brings us to the Plato problem. In the allegory of the cave, Plato describes prisoners chained up, watching shadows on a wall, thinking those shadows are reality. Then one guy breaks free, goes outside, sees the actual sun, and comes back to tell the others. You'd think they would be happy, right? Wrong. They want to kill him. Why? Because the light hurts their eyes. Because the truth destroys the comfort of the illusion. Kennedy's administration was an attempt to drag America out of the cave. The moon landing wasn't just about beating the Soviets, it was about elevating human consciousness. It was about looking up instead of looking down. It was a Promethean move, stealing fire from the gods to give it to the people. But as history shows us, from Socrates to Jesus to Lincoln, the guys who try to break the chains usually end up martyrs. The cave dwellers get violent when you mess with their shadow puppets. It is like that scene in The Truman Show where Jim Carrey finally hits the wall of the studio. The system will do anything, wind, rain, lightning, psychological gaslighting, to keep him from opening that door. Kennedy was reaching for the door handle. And then, the inevitable snap. The assassination itself. The quantum psychology of national trauma. When that rifle cracked in Dealey Plaza, it wasn't just a murder, it was a psychological nuclear bomb detonated in the living room of every American family. It created a massive wave of cognitive dissonance. The human mind is wired for causality, big effects must have big causes. A giant tower falls, it must be a giant earthquake. A beloved president dies, it must be a massive conspiracy. But the official narrative, the magic bullet theory, the lone nut with the mail-order rifle, asked us to believe that the most powerful man on earth could be erased by a mediocrity, by a glitch. It violated our internal logic. It is like the end of Inception where the top wobbles, and you aren't sure if you are in reality or a dream. The Warren Commission essentially told us, don't look at the top. Just trust us, it fell. But our subconscious knew better. Our collective gut screamed that the math didn't add up. This is why conspiracy theories aren't just for guys with tinfoil hats in their basements, they are a psychological defense mechanism. The mind would rather believe in an evil, all-powerful Illuminati than accept that history is random and meaningless. We imposed causality on the event because we had to. As Kant might say, we force order onto chaos because we cannot survive the alternative. We cannot survive the idea that the driver of the bus can be taken out by a pebble in the road. There is also the death denial comedy hour to consider. America in the early 60s was high on its own supply, technological triumphalism, post-war optimism, the belief that science would cure death itself. We were invincible, we were the good guys. And then, blam, we were forced to stare at the mortality of our golden boy. It is the ultimate mood killer. It is like that scene in Dr. Strangelove where they are calmly discussing the end of the world like it is a menu option at a diner. We intellectualize death until it shows up uninvited. Kennedy's death ripped the mask off the polite fiction of immortality. As I sit here, blending the street-level view with the high-altitude philosophy, I realize that what we are dealing with is the Enochian perspective. The Book of Enoch talks about the Watchers giving forbidden knowledge to humanity, and the chaos that followed. The Kennedy saga feels like that. It feels like we glimpsed the gears of the machine. We saw the deep state before we had a name for it. We saw the collision of the visible government and the invisible government. And like Michael Corleone in The Godfather sitting in that diner, realizing his life is about to change forever, we lost our innocence. We realized that the guys in the suits weren't always the good guys. So, This first leg of the audit leaves us with a heavy realization. Kennedy wasn't just a politician, he was a philosophical problem for a system built on mediocrity and control. He tried to introduce quality, as Persig might call it, into a system built on quantity. He tried to introduce truth into a system built on shadows. And the system responded with the immune response of a great white shark. But we aren't done yet. The body is still warm on the table of history, and there are more layers to peel back. We have to look at the aftermath, the cover-up, and the long shadow cast by the Umbrella Man. We have to look at why the best and the brightest decided that the only way to save the village was to burn it down. When I return to the file, I can feel a slight shift in my own psychology, the way you feel when you leave a bright, air-conditioned lobby and step into a dimly lit hallway that smells like ozone and old copper coins. The first half of Kennedy's story is illuminated by achievements, speeches, hopes, and glimpses of what a society could be if it stopped sabotaging itself for 5 minutes. But the second half requires a different kind of sight, the kind you use when you're trying to identify a shape at the end of a dark alley, and you're pretty sure that shape is holding a lead pipe. Kennedy's presidency carries a second narrative underneath the official one, a shadow logic that requires detective work more than remembrance. What comes next isn't simply political analysis, it's philosophical archaeology with a side of crime scene investigation. Every presidency has a point where the story shifts from ascent to reckoning. For Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs marks that shift. It is the hinge where idealistic momentum collides with the immovable weight of institutional self-interest. I read the account again, quietly picturing the situation like a scene from Mission Impossible, except the guy in the van listening to your earpiece is actually trying to get you killed. You have a new president, eager to prove himself, trusting the national security apparatus because that's what presidents are conditioned to do. They assume the guys with the clipboards and the security clearances are the adults in the room. Only, Kennedy finds out the apparatus has handed him a grenade with the pin half pulled and the instructions written in invisible ink. The plan was doomed from the start, under-resourced, poorly conceived, and fueled by the delusional belief that Cubans would overthrow Castro on command like background actors waiting for a director to yell, "Action." Kennedy's decision not to escalate during the disaster exposes the glitch in the matrix. First, he was not the warmonger the Nazi International faction, to borrow from Joseph P. Farrell expected him to be. Second, he wasn't going to be manipulated. Most leaders, when handed a disaster by their advisors, double down to protect their pride. They commit to the losing hand just to avoid admitting they're holding a pair of twos. Kennedy did the opposite. He stopped the madness, accepted public blame, and internalized the lesson. A Stoic doesn't fear responsibility, he fears becoming the kind of fool who refuses to learn from it. But to the deep state, this wasn't learning, this was betrayal. The psychological cost of defying the intelligence community is rarely noted in the history books, which prefer to pretend the CIA is just a patriotic Rotary Club with pistols. But intelligence agencies are built on secrecy, hierarchy, and memories longer than an elephant with a grudge. They don't treat public embarrassment as a harmless accident, they treat it as a breach of contract. When Kennedy criticized the CIA afterward, threatening to splinter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, the tension between him and the shadow apparatus transformed into something structural. It's the classic pattern Plato warned about. When the philosopher challenges the guardians of the state, the guardians start wondering if the philosopher is an operational liability. Or, as Jim Marrs might put it, that's when the rule by secrecy decides it's time for a regime change. The next major crisis in the file is civil rights. People often discuss this as a moral issue, and it was, but it was also a psychological and political battlefield, the kind where every decision came wrapped in C4. Kennedy initially played a delicate game, careful not to alienate the Southern Democrats who held key positions in Congress. This wasn't cowardice, it was an understanding of legislative physics. You cannot pass national reform while antagonizing the very individuals who control the committees. But when the violence in Birmingham went national, when the dogs and the fire hoses came out, the moral calculus shifted. Kennedy didn't just react, he reframed the struggle. He cast civil rights not as a regional squabble but as a test of America's soul, a mirror forcing the nation to see itself with unfiltered clarity. To frame a political crisis as a spiritual crisis is a move straight out of the Gospels and the Stoics, show people the contradiction between who they claim to be and how they actually behave. That rhetorical move destabilizes people internally. It forces them to reconcile the difference or retreat into denial. Kennedy's speech wasn't merely political, it was diagnostic. He identified hypocrisy as a national autoimmune disease. And any leader who diagnoses an illness threatens the people who profit from keeping everyone sick. This brings me to the economic reforms, specifically the radioactive topic of Executive Order 11110. I study this section carefully, acknowledging the official debunks, but then I apply the Joseph P. Farrell filter, the financial vipers of Venice lens. Whether Kennedy was directly challenging the Federal Reserve or merely adjusting silver-backed currency logistics matters less than the philosophical signal he was sending. He was touching the money. And you never touch the money. Money systems are the nervous system of modern power. They control more than economies. They control the psychological rhythms of a society, its anxieties, ambitions, dependencies, and illusions of security. The Federal Reserve isn't federal, and it has no reserves. It's a private banking cartel renting the nation's own currency back to it at interest. It's the ultimate company store model. By issuing silver certificates, money based on tangible value rather than debt, Kennedy was tinkering with the machinery behind the curtain. He was threatening the banksters. It's not just that he committed an economic heresy, it's that he demonstrated he was willing to question the foundational assumptions of the debt slavery system. The philosopher in him was showing. And systems do not like to be philosophically questioned. If you ask the wrong questions about power, power starts asking questions about you, specifically, how do we remove this variable? Then comes Vietnam, the slow-burning psychological tragedy of the era, and the favorite cash cow of the military-industrial complex. Historians love to debate Kennedy's intentions, pointing to the escalation of advisors. But if you read NSAM 263, and you listen to the tapes, and you look at the pattern of his presidency, a different picture emerges. It aligns with the Stoic mindset. When faced with chaotic forces, favor de-escalation, diplomacy, and realism over macho posturing. This isn't weakness, it's discipline. It's the same instinct that prevented him from bombing Cuba or invading after the Bay of Pigs. When I consider Vietnam in this light, I ask the deeper question, what kind of leader would Kennedy have been as the war grew? The answer emerges from the total pattern. He would not have allowed it to metastasize into the generational wound it became. He was preparing to pull the plug, and that makes his trajectory incompatible with the interests of the war machine, a machine that needs conflict like a vampire needs type O negative. Here, the philosophical and the political intersect. A man who resists unnecessary war inevitably collides with the institutions that rely on perpetual conflict for their budget and their relevance. Kennedy's foreign policy is often packaged as idealistic, but that word feels inadequate, like calling a tiger, kitty. Idealism without critical thinking is sentimentality. Kennedy wasn't sentimental, he was analytical. He viewed the world not as a risk board but as a psychological ecosystem. He understood that fear magnifies conflict, pride triggers escalation, and miscommunication breeds catastrophe. His leadership during the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrates this worldview more clearly than any speech. But it also reveals his fatal flaw. Rational leaders are slow poison to irrational systems. The system thrives on fear, Kennedy was peddling hope. The system thrives on war, Kennedy was peddling peace. The system thrives on secrecy, Kennedy was threatening to turn on the lights. As I continue through the file, I find myself quietly mapping the psychological landscape of the government around him. The intelligence agencies saw him as an unpredictable amateur who refused to play the game. The military saw him as soft, because he didn't want to start World War III over a tropical island. The segregationist politicians saw him as a traitor to the old order. The international bankers saw him as a threat to the debt paradigm. The civil rights movement saw him as their only hope. The people saw him as a rock star. In systems theory, that kind of multidirectional tension is not sustainable. It's like a bridge vibrating at the wrong frequency, eventually, the concrete cracks. When too many power centers feel threatened by the same individual, the equilibrium shifts toward removal, by election, by scandal, or by the Tex Mars option, the ritual king kill. The deeper I go, the more I sense the philosophical paradox of Kennedy's presidency. He was attempting something structurally incompatible with the machinery he inherited. He was trying to steer institutions that functioned best when left to their habitual inertia. Bureaucracies don't like acceleration or redirection, they like autopilot. And Kennedy refused autopilot. He grabbed the wheel. That refusal marks him not just as a president but as a philosopher-statesman, a category that historically has a survival rate of roughly 0. Plato warned about the fate of the philosopher who enters the cave to help liberate the prisoners. The prisoners don't always want the light. Sometimes they view the liberator as a threat. They like the shadows. The shadows are comfortable. The shadows don't ask you to change. This pattern repeats across civilizations. The Spartans executed reformers. The Romans murdered philosophers who challenged emperors. The medieval church suppressed thinkers who challenged doctrine. Modern institutions use more subtle tools: character assassination, political isolation, bureaucratic sabotage, and when all else fails, a lone nut with a magical rifle. In Kennedy's case, the pattern feels tragically familiar: a man trying to elevate public consciousness in a system designed to suppress it. He spoke to people's higher nature, but institutions operate on lower incentives. He aimed at the moon but landed in the crosshairs of multiple empires within the empire. I reflect on this paradox, considering it from a psychological, philosophical, and theological angle. Theologically, Kennedy fits the mold of the reluctant prophet, someone who sees the moral contradictions of their age and tries to reconcile them. Philosophically, he resembles the Stoic ruler, the person who tries to apply rationality to spheres dominated by ego, fear, and greed. Psychologically, he embodies the archetype of the transformational leader, someone who disrupts old patterns by introducing new frames of meaning. But transformative leaders make unstable alliances. When you elevate people, you unsettle their handlers. When you challenge the powerful, they begin to calculate. When you touch the structural currents of society, race, war, finance, security, UFOs, if you believe the memo, you inevitably awaken forces that resist change with the violence of a cornered animal. By the time I reach the end of the file, the philosophical vector becomes clear to me. Kennedy wasn't just a political figure, he was a test. A test of whether a modern system could tolerate reform from within. A test of whether rationality could govern institutions fueled by fear. A test of whether a nation built on ideals could remain loyal to them when the check came due. The answer, revealed not by speeches but by the ballistics in Dealey Plaza, is sobering. Systems resist elevation. They prefer equilibrium, even if that equilibrium is a nightmare. Kennedy's legacy isn't simply nostalgia or tragedy. It's a mirror. It shows us what leadership looks like when fused with morality, logic, and courage. But it also shows us the price of such leadership. He stands as a reminder that progress is not only about what can be achieved but also about what forces rise to stop it. When I close the file for the final time, I feel that quiet hum again, the electric signal of unresolved truth. This audit wasn't just an examination of Kennedy's presidency. It was an examination of humanity's perpetual struggle between its higher potential and its lower impulses. Kennedy tried to pull the nation upward, but gravity, and the guys who own the gravity, are relentless. And yet, the trajectory he set, the vector, still exists. The paradox of Camelot is that even an interrupted dream can illuminate the path forward. The question isn't whether Kennedy succeeded. The question is whether we still understand what he attempted. But before we light the votive candles and start weeping into our whiskey, we have to pull back for a second. We have to laugh. Because if you stare at the abyss of the deep state for too long without cracking a smile, you don't become a philosopher, you become a conspiracy theorist living in a van down by the river yelling at squirrels about the Federal Reserve. And Kennedy, the man had wit. He understood the absurdity of the stage he was walking on. I like to imagine what an Eddie Izzard routine about JFK's specific brand of linguistic charisma would look like. It would probably go something like this. Zerga steps into the spotlight, adopting the surreal, transatlantic wandering tone of Izzard, pantomiming a microphone. So, Kennedy goes to Berlin, right? 1963. The wall is there. It's a bit grim. It's very gray. And he wants to do the big Roman speech. He wants to do the civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. Very serious, very toga, very marble statue, but he has to do it in German. German is a tricky language. It's full of trapdoors and angry verbs. It's like playing Scrabble with a bag of rusty nails. So he stands up there, looking fantastic, because he's JFK. He wakes up looking like he's ready for a GQ cover shoot, and he yells, Ich bin ein Berliner. And the crowd goes wild. Yay, he is one of us. But in the back, way in the back, there's a local baker named Klaus. And Klaus is confused. He's wiping flour off his apron, looking around. Mimes Klaus looking deeply skeptical, holding an imaginary pretzel. Wait, Did he just say he is a donut? A jam-filled donut? Is that a metaphor? Is he saying he is sweet on the inside but covered in powdered sugar? Is the American strategy to defeat the Soviets with high glycemic pastries? Single quote. Because a Berliner is a donut. It's a pastry. He literally told the free world, I am a jelly donut. But here is the thing about Kennedy, and this is why he was the king. The Germans knew he said he was a donut. They knew, but they didn't care. They were just so happy he was there. They were thinking, yes, we are all donuts today. We are all filled with the jam of liberty. If this handsome man says we are pastries, then by God, bring out the coffee. Now, imagine if Nixon did that. Imagine Richard Nixon, sweating, shoulders hunched, jowls shaking, yelling, I am a donut. Mimes Nixon doing the double victory fingers while looking like a haunted gargoyle. The crowd wouldn't cheer. They'd be terrified. Klaus the baker would be yelling, no. You are a stale crouton. Get off the stage before you crumble. Zerga drops the persona, the smile fading back into the serious, street scholar gaze. That laughter, that's the coping mechanism, but it also highlights the tragedy. Kennedy could get away with being a donut because he carried the weight of a genuine human spirit. He had that rare, electric connection that transcends syntax. And that brings me to the final, uncomfortable conclusion of this audit. I'm going to make a claim here that might upset the historians who like their presidents to be safe, bureaucratic managers. I'm going to argue that John F. Kennedy was perhaps our last great president. I don't mean great in the sense of moral perfection. The man was flawed. He was a sinner. He had secrets that would make a confessional booth burst into flames. But he was great in the classical sense, in the sense that he was a driver, not a passenger. Since November 22, 1963, the presidency has largely become a management position. It's a role for caretakers. Presidents after Kennedy have been administrators of the decline, managers of the status quo, or teleprompter readers for the hidden committee. They govern within the lines. They color inside the shapes provided by the intelligence agencies and the financial cartels. Kennedy was the last one who tried to grab the wheel and turn the car around. He was the last one who looked at the CIA and said, you work for me. He was the last one who looked at the Federal Reserve and said, this math doesn't add up. He was the last one who looked at the military-industrial complex and said, we are not going to war just to keep your factories running. He was the last one who tried to act like an emperor of the people rather than a CEO of a subsidiary. He represented the end of the American frontier spirit in politics, the belief that the future is something we create, not something we endure. After him, the system tightened its grip. The watchers, to bring back our Enochian friends, decided that they would never again allow a variable that wild to enter the equation. They put in safeguards. They put in handlers. They made sure the candidates were vetted by the banks before they ever reached the ballot. So when we look back at JFK, we aren't just mourning a man. We are mourning a timeline. We are looking at a divergent path where the United States chose exploration over exploitation, truth over secrecy, and courage over comfort. That path is overgrown now, covered in weeds and warning signs. But the signpost is still there, marking the spot where the car went off the road. He was the last giant before the era of the pygmies. He was the last flash of lightning before the long, gray rain. And even if you think he was a myth, or a fraud, or just a lucky politician, you have to admit one thing. For 1,037 days, the world held its breath and looked up at the stars, instead of down at the ledger. And we haven't looked up the same way since. Zerga, in synthesis with the philosophers,